They understood that black people were human beings. They just did not care. Basic decency was something they really owed only to white people, and when it came down to it, black people's lives did not matter all that much. Black lives were there for the taking. Their world cast its long shadow onto ours. Hi everyone, it's Dave and Olive. Thanks for joining us here at Book Blather today. Today we're doing something a little different. We're going to do just a book review of an individual book. As you can see, Olive is here with me, but we're not going to do any of our usual corny video. Today we wanted to just do a serious video on a book about a very serious topic. And that book is The Ledger and the Chain by Joshua D. Rothman. Joshua D. Rothman is a history professor at the University of Alabama, and as it says on the cover, this book is about how domestic slave traders shaped America. So I'm embarrassed to say that I actually knew almost nothing about this topic. I have a very basic knowledge of U.S. slavery that we all learn in school, but I knew virtually nothing about the domestic slave trade in the early years of this country. I'm ashamed to say that I really had no idea that there was a massive business built around the buying and selling of people within the country among the various states in the early years of the U.S. So, I assume I'm not alone in this. And I think it's evidence as a failure in the U.S. education system. I'm not sure why that is. I guess, it's a topic that's uncomfortable to talk about. We have a lot of dark chapters in this country's history, and, some of these things are even difficult to even admit, much less talk about. But obviously those are the things that we absolutely most should be talking about, learning about and discussing and educating others about, so that we can, get a grasp on an understanding of the long-term implications of these things, and to make sure that these kinds of things, or modern incarnations of them don't happen again. So this is not the type of, I don't often read this type of history book, but I was watching Steve Donoghue's channel. Some of you may know he's an editor and receives a lot of books in the mail prior to publication, and he had opened up this one and was pretty excited to have it. And when I saw it, I said, wow, I don't know anything about that. And that seems like required reading. So I got it as soon as it came out. It was published towards the end of April. I got it as soon as it came out, and I read it right away. And it was a pretty detailed, harrowing recounting of the slave trade in the first half of the 19th century leading up to the Civil War. So what the book talked about was, in 1808, Congress passed a federal law that banned the transatlantic slave trade, bringing enslaved people into the country from abroad. And what that did was it had the effect of creating a domestic slave trade market. And at the time there were things, for example, the demand for tobacco waned, and at the same time that these were happening, the production of cotton and sugarcane was exploding, and so there was less of a need for labor in some of the northern states like Maryland and Virginia, and more of a need in some of the more southern states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. And so this domestic slave trade business was born. And this book basically follows the travels of three individuals who were probably the most influential domestic slave traders. Um, Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, and to a lesser extent, Isaac Franklin's nephew, James Franklin. And they started a business, Franklin and Armfield, that was centered around buying and selling enslaved people among the states and throughout the country. And so basically they set up this system where John Armfield and Rice Ballard were stationed in Virginia, in Alexandria, and Richmond, primarily for most of the time, on the waterways connected to the Chesapeake Bay. And Isaac Franklin and his nephew were stationed in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Natchez, Mississippi, primarily. And with this system, John Armfield and Rice Ballard would acquire and transport enslaved people to the Franklins in Louisiana and Mississippi, where they then would be sold. And so they created this business and really built it up. And they made all sorts of business contacts, established relationships with banks, got a network of purchasing agents, and even acquired their own jails to house all the enslaved people that they rounded up, and their own ships, so that they could transport these enslaved people from the Chesapeake Bay area for these enslaved people that they had captured in Maryland and Virginia, and they could transport them on the ships down to Louisiana, where they could be offloaded, and then up the Mississippi to Natchez, where more could be offloaded. And they essentially created this massive economic empire, all based on the vile practice of trafficking people. And it's they became under this scheme, they massively increased the size of the population of enslaved people in this country, and all the emotional and physical atrocities that went along with that. And they got rich, some of the richest men in the country in the process. And contrary to conventional wisdom, they were well-known and admired and well-respected businessmen for several decades. And it's a tough book to read. It's tough in terms of the subject matter. The book itself is actually pretty readable. It's not quite as long as it looks, because it's very well researched. So the last third of the book is all citations. And it's also readable, I thought, in terms, it wasn't really a dry recitation of historical facts. It was told in terms of the story of these three infamous domestic slave traders, and from the stories of some of the enslaved, and also of some of the enslaved who helped these domestic slave traders manage other enslaved people. And so, it was a pretty eye-opening book for me. It helped give me a little more perspective on our history, and I think it's a really important book. That was why I thought it was important to do really just an individual video to talk just about this book. I hope if if you're able to read this sort of book, I hope that people read it, because I think it's a pretty vitally important story. So that's about it. Thanks for watching today. If you have read this, or you think you might read it, or you have any other thoughts about it, let me know. I'd be happy to talk with people about it. And in the meantime, take care of yourself and each other, and Olive and I will see you next time. Bye.